NATO foreign ministers are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the military alliance. The ceremony was on the second day of their summit in Brussels. The foreign ministers of the 32 members are considering plans to provide a long-term military aid package to Ukraine. That's worth $107 billion over the next 5 years. The Kremlin says relations between Russia and NATO have sunk to the level of direct confrontation. In a moment, we'll hear the latest on these developments from Yulia Shapovalova in Moscow. But first, let's talk to Charles Stratford. He's joining us from Kyiv. So, Charles, what can we expect from NATO going forward when it comes to supporting Ukraine over the long term?
Well, certainly according to some of the statements that are being made as this summit in Brussels comes to an end by various different foreign ministers, they are pledging long-term support via this plan that a lot more work needs to be done on. And that's according to basically all the diplomats that have come on camera and made statements to the press. I'll read you out a few of them. The NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has said that discussing how we can create a more robust, predictable, institutionalized framework for NATO support to Ukraine is what they are really focusing on in the weeks and months ahead. And he's referring effectively to the summit in July that is expected to be held in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of unanswered questions about this plan that need to be discussed, including the amount of money for this 5-year fund and exactly how or where that money is going to come from. We've already heard reservations by some diplomats as to how that is going to be possible. But words of great encouragement, as I suppose you'd expect from the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Again, speaking in the last hour or so, he said that support for Ukraine from the NATO alliance remained rock solid. And he said again that Ukraine will become eventually a member of NATO. He said the purpose of the summit in July is to help build a bridge to that membership and a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. With respect to Ukraine's immediate needs, though, and that's where we've seen so much emphasis coming from the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, who of course is attending that summit. He's been meeting with some of his counterparts there in Brussels. And he now says that he has had assurances from those NATO members that they have agreed to identify and find air defense systems in their arsenals that they can send to Ukraine. Because, of course, Ukraine in recent weeks has come under an escalation of Russian attacks using many ballistic missiles and these kamikaze drones. Only one the latest one last night in Kharkiv, where we understand at least 4 people were killed in that attack. Kuleba says that in March alone, Russia used 94 ballistic missiles in these attacks. So it's the immediate needs that are so important for Ukraine, as these rumours, speculation, certainly amongst members of the defence establishment here in Ukraine and military analysts will say that they're expecting potentially a push by Russia for Moscow to try and push its forces further into Ukraine in a spring or summer offensive in the coming months.
Okay, let's find out the view from Russia. Thank you, Charles, for the time being. That's Yulia joining us from Moscow. So Russia has been speaking out on the 75th anniversary of NATO. What did they have to say?
Yeah, exactly. We've heard from a number of diplomats saying that the alliance played a key role in the confrontation with the USSR during Soviet times, and now its aggressive behavior is directed against Russia. And Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov called NATO a destabilizing factor on the European conflict continent that does not contribute to security and stability, and that relations between Russia and NATO have slipped to the level of direct confrontation now. He noted that the alliance is directly involved in the conflict in Ukraine and continues to advance towards the Russian borders. So obviously, officially, there are no NATO boots on the ground, but here in Russia, we constantly hear about foreign mercenaries from NATO countries fighting on the Ukrainian side, and recent talks from Emmanuel Macron to send French troops to Ukraine have been strongly condemned here. In fact, we've been hearing how dangerous NATO is for decades here. Even long before 2022, when Russia actually launched its special military operation, the country's leadership was constantly saying that Ukraine was going to join NATO, and that was a direct threat to Russia's national security, that NATO was sending their military instructors to train the Ukrainian military personnel and supplied Ukraine with weapons. But then it was Russia who launched its invasion, and Ukraine had to defend and still has to defend its land. And in fact, we remember with what kind of weapons Ukraine met the Russian army back in February 2022. Those were mainly Soviet-style weapons, as well as defensive weapons such as the anti-tank Javelin systems, as well as the NLAW anti-tank system. And only half a year later, in summer 2022, Ukraine began receiving other NATO weapons like artillery shells, tanks, armored vehicles, and defense systems, and so on. And of course, Ukraine is still waiting for the F-16 fighter jets. There's been a lot of talk about that. But what is certain is that a number of Ukrainian pilots are undergoing training, learning how to pilot them.
All right. Thank you so much, Yulia.